On the evening of January 2nd, 1991, in the quiet city of St. John's, Newfoundland, 19-year-old Greg Parsons raced through his childhood home at 16 James Place, frantic and horrified by what he had just discovered. His mother, 45-year-old Catherine Carroll, lay brutalized in a pool of her own blood in the upstairs bathroom. She had been slashed and stabbed a staggering 53 times in a vicious attack. As Greg screamed for help, little did he know that this horrific tragedy was just the beginning of a decades-long nightmare that would rob him of his freedom and nearly his will to live. For Greg Parsons was about to be accused, charged, and convicted of murdering his own mother in an act of unthinkable betrayal.
Welcome to Innocent Convicts, where we expose the injustice of wrongful convictions. Each episode takes you behind the bars of a case gone horribly wrong, shining a light on the human errors and flawed system that cost an innocent person their freedom. Brace yourself for chilling accounts of coerced confessions, mishandled evidence, and real-life horror stories of the innocent branded as criminals. But you'll also hear the inspirational fights waged by families, advocates, and legal warriors who refuse to let the truth be buried. When justice goes wrong, the consequences are catastrophic. Join us as we pursue the truth and honor the resilience of the wrongfully convicted. The pursuit of justice never rests on innocent convicts.
Known for its rugged beauty, colorful row houses, and fishing villages, St. John's, Newfoundland is generally considered a safe and pleasant place to raise a family. This idyllic backdrop made the murder of Catherine Carroll all that more disturbing to locals. Divorced from her husband and living alone without any spousal support, Catherine was a struggling single mother battling alcohol addiction and mental health issues. While her relationship with her son Greg was strained at times due to her troubles, he remained devoted, regularly checking in on her to ensure she was okay. Having had to grow up very quickly and fend for himself financially, Greg had started his own business at 16 and eventually moved into a place of his own. The start of 1991 should have been a time of celebration and fresh beginnings for a then 19-year-old Greg. Just after the ball dropped and fireworks lit the night sky on New Year's Eve, the teenager called his mother to exchange well wishes, continuing their tradition even though he was ringing in the new year with his girlfriend Tina and her family. It would be the last time Greg heard his mother's voice. Nearly 2 days later, after trying repeatedly to reach Catherine by phone with no success, Greg had a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong, a feeling only compounded with each unanswered ring. By 10:30 p.m. on the evening of January 2nd, Greg's rising panic drove him and Tina to his childhood home to check on his mother's well-being. Upon arriving at the weather department, Greg's attempts to open the front door proved futile. It was locked from the inside. The family dog was riled into a frenzy, barking and yelping hysterically. Worried but undeterred, Greg found an unlocked ground-level window and climbed into the house, desperate to find Catherine unharmed. What he discovered instead was a scene of unimaginable carnage. His 45-year-old mother lying on the bathroom floor, brutalized with such savagery that she was practically unrecognizable. In those first shocking moments, a distraught Greg could do little more than unleash a guttural scream as he frantically called 911 for help. His worst nightmare was now a reality, and the darkness that followed would shake his life to its core. As police swarmed the blood-spattered crime scene, a young Greg could only watch in shock and despair, having just lost one of the most important people in his life. Yet this horrific tragedy was only the beginning of his descent into a decades-long nightmare. What should have been a thorough, impartial investigation into the brutal slaying of Catherine Carroll quickly went awry from the outset. Police theorized, based on the crime scene, that the killer knew the victim and had access to her home, zeroing in on her 19-year-old son as the prime suspect, despite his anguished cries over finding her mutilated body. An unlikely source fueled the premature prosecution of the bereaved teenager. Greg's childhood friend Brian Doyle, who lived just 2 doors down from the Parsons home. Doyle unexpectedly came forward to regale investigators with an outrageous story of how years earlier, Greg's amateur heavy metal band had recorded a song titled "Kill Your Parents." Despite the obvious adolescent silliness of such shock rock lyrics, police were hooked by Doyle's revelation of this tape's existence, treating it as a damning confession of matricidal intent. With Greg now squarely in their sights, police grew increasingly convinced he was the culprit behind the savage murder. An autopsy showed Catherine had been stabbed 53 times with a serrated knife blade in an attack seemingly motivated by hatred and anger rather than a crime of passion. The positioning of her body and diluted blood evidence suggested the killer had showered in her bathroom to clean up after the frenzied assault. Fueling the case against Greg even further was his inability to provide a full alibi for his whereabouts between 4 a.m. on New Year's Day, when he returned home from celebrating the holiday festivities with his girlfriend's family, and 10:30 p.m. on January 2nd, when he discovered his mother's body. To investigators, the lack of an account for those 42 hours created a cloud of reasonable doubt over Greg's proclaimed innocence. 8 days after the gruesome discovery that first sent him reeling into unrelenting grief, Greg's life was utterly shattered. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary charged the teen with first-degree murder for butchering Catherine, despite not having a shred of forensic evidence actually linking Greg to the chilling crime scene. With ludicrous justifications fueled by tunnel vision and hearsay about his troubled relationship with his mother, police had already railroaded Greg Parsons as a homicidal monster. With the police's narrative casting Greg as the culprit firmly set, prosecutors in Newfoundland barreled forward with bringing the incredible case to trial in 1994. Despite the glaring lack of any physical evidence tying the 19-year-old to the grisly crime scene, the Crown's strategy relied heavily on characterizing Greg as an angry, resentful son who had murderous hatred for Catherine. Their most damning piece of evidence was the existence of the amateurish "Kill Your Parents" song. Prosecutors mischaracterized the tape as concrete proof of Greg's supposed homicidal tendencies toward Catherine. As ludicrous as that argument seems, it proved devastatingly effective. Darren Bent, a journalist who covered the trial extensively, would later report that when the jury heard that, he didn't think there was any way that case could have been won by the defense, no matter what evidence they produced. St. John's-based attorney Robert Simmons, who represented Parsons, said that this was never an impartial, objectively undertaken investigation based upon hard fact. They attempted to use this song as indicative of a state of mind, a state of hatred, a clear indication that he had it out for his mother, and that is without a doubt very flimsy, very circumstantial, and absolutely inconclusive. Over 5 long months, a procession of witnesses took the stand to portray Greg as an evil, abusive son that Catherine legitimately feared and mistrusted. With no credible evidence to counter that false narrative, the jurors swiftly delivered a shocking, guilty verdict for second-degree murder after just 6 days of deliberations. Pandemonium erupted in the courtroom as his devastated girlfriend Tina cried out, begging to embrace her boyfriend one last time, as a group of guards swarmed Greg to begin serving his life sentence behind bars on February 15, 1994. The idea of her only child murdering her in such a brutal fashion was unfathomable to Catherine's loved ones. In the eyes of the law, Greg was condemned as a matricidal monster who had taken his mother's life in the most unimaginable way. However, the nightmare was far from over, despite the finality of Greg's conviction. His defense team swiftly launched an appeal, arguing that the case had been a textbook example of sloppy police work, tunnel vision, and a dearth of credible evidence to charge Greg, let alone convict him of murder. In a shocking turn of events, the appeals court agreed and overturned the guilty verdict just 68 days into Greg's life sentence at Her Majesty's Penitentiary. He was granted bail and temporary freedom as he awaited a second trial that could potentially re-vindicate him or see his young life permanently stolen behind bars. For Greg, the years that followed his wrongful incarceration were filled with unrelenting torment, both psychological and physical. He was treated as a reviled murderer by authorities despite maintaining his innocence, with police allegedly even sicking a dog on him during one confrontation while awaiting a new trial. Trapped in a veritable living nightmare, he did his best to carry on. In an attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, Greg and Tina, who had remained defiantly convinced of his innocence through the harrowing legal odyssey, allowed themselves a fleeting moment of hope. They took the opportunity to move their relationship forward during this period, marrying and soon welcoming their first son, Zachary, into the world. Even as Greg's next round of court proceedings loomed, they dared to hope that the truth would one day come to light and exonerate him. That day arrived in dramatic fashion in 1998, when brand new DNA testing, not available at the time of the original trial, was conducted on evidence from the crime scene. The DNA testing, specifically using the polymerase chain reaction method, allows scientists to make millions of copies of a specific DNA sample, essentially amplifying a very small sample sufficiently so that it can be studied in detail. The results revealed that an unknown male DNA sample had been found mixed with Catherine's blood, definitively ruling out Greg as her assailant. After 8 years of having his freedom stolen by a horrific injustice, Greg Parsons was finally vindicated. He could hold his head high again, an innocent man at long last, fully exonerated of murdering one of the people he loved most in the world. Yet the fairy tale ending of Greg's legal journey being over was still but a fleeting dream. For in that DNA evidence which cleared his name also lay the shocking revelation of who had actually killed his mother. Realizing their monumental mistake, police relaunched their efforts from square one, this time seeking the true culprit through more rigorous means. Over 150 DNA samples were collected from individuals and tested against the crime scene evidence, but none yielded a match. Investigators found themselves grasping at straws until an anonymous tip finally provided a lead. The call directed police to take a closer look at Brian Doyle, Greg's childhood friend, who had paradoxically helped build the prosecution's case against him years earlier by revealing the existence of the Kill Your Parents song. Upon discreetly obtaining a DNA sample from one of Doyle's relatives, the chilling truth soon became clear. The unknown genetic evidence collected from Greg's mother's body was a near-certain match to the innocuous-seeming Doyle. Police would now have to covertly build a case against the real killer. By the late 1990s, Brian Doyle had relocated to the Toronto area, seemingly living an ordinary life while Catherine Carroll's murder went unsolved for a decade. Police quickly initiated secret surveillance, working with Ontario authorities to stealthily collect a discarded cigarette butt from Doyle that could provide a direct DNA sample. Sure enough, forensic testing proved beyond doubt that Doyle's genetic fingerprints lined up perfectly with the male profile found at the bloody 1991 crime scene where Greg Parsons had discovered his mother's body. Doyle had butchered Catherine on that fateful New Year's night, then calmly went about his life as police zeroed in on Greg as their prime suspect. Not only had Brian willfully let his innocent friend go to prison for a crime he didn't commit, the supposed loyal confidant had actually attended Greg's wedding, even signing the guest book with a mocking message that included 3 highs and a bye-bye as if to taunt Greg, insinuating that he would be going back to prison. It was an act of shocking depravity and betrayal, made even more disturbing as details of Brian's involvement in Catherine's murder came to light. With this crucial DNA authentication finally identifying the real killer, police launched an elaborately staged undercover operation aimed at getting Doyle to confess to the shocking massacre he had knowingly pinned on his former friend. Playing into criminal elements in Doyle's psyche, investigators deployed a Mr. Big sting, portraying themselves as crime bosses looking to recruit Doyle as a new member capable of carrying out contracted hits. The undercover video captured during the sting operation showed Doyle's cool calculation as he agreed to a hypothetical murder contract from an undercover officer posing as the crime boss. His excuse that he had murdered before and gotten away with it proved chillingly prophetic. According to Brian's own sickening admissions, he had slipped into Greg's family home through an unlocked basement window while wearing shoes that were not his own. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and made his way upstairs where he brutally attacked Catherine as she lay in the bathroom, slashing and stabbing her over and over until she was nearly decapitated. In a horrifying account of the murder, Brian recalled how the family dog had excitedly greeted him at first before being sent into a frenzy as the vicious bloodbath unfolded. He described Catherine's desperate final words asking, What are you doing here, Greg?" as she mistook her killer for her own son in her last moments. After inflicting 53 savage wounds, Brian calmly stepped over Catherine's dying body to take a shower and wash away her blood before returning to a New Year's Eve party he had left earlier, as if nothing had happened. In a chilling reenactment after his arrest, Doyle took police back to the scene of the crime over a decade later, guiding them through the house while narrating step by step how he carried out the vicious attack. He then led investigators to a nearby fenced-in area where the knife used to slaughter Catherine remained undisturbed all those years, an area original police incompetently never bothered searching after pinning her murder on the innocent Greg from the outset. The depraved Doyle's lack of remorse was perhaps most evident in his recounting of how he slept like a baby and felt no guilt over the crime that landed Greg Parsons in prison. The rationale Brian offered for murdering his friend's mother ranged from blaming alcoholism to outrageous claims that he was freeing Greg from an allegedly abusive parent, and even pettier suggestions that he held a hatred for Greg, thinking he was a big shot in their social circle. Even though police had Brian Doyle's repulsive confession on tape, DNA evidence putting him at the scene, and the recovered murder weapon, the killer still managed to cut a deal. He pled guilty to second-degree murder at trial in 2003 and received a life sentence with a chance of parole after 18 years. A slap on the wrist in the eyes of Greg Parsons, who watched an unrepentant Doyle receive a fraction of the harsh sentence he as an innocent man had been given. To make matters even more painful, evidence of Brian plotting the murder ahead of time and purposefully seeking an alibi was apparently never presented in court due to the plea bargain. The horror of Doyle's savage betrayal and the injustice of his paltry sentence has been a crushing weight, adding to Greg's trauma of losing his beloved mother so brutally. While he has done his best to move forward, the decades of torment have left permanent scars. Greg continues to have night terrors, dreaming he is still incarcerated and haunted by flashes of his mother's mutilated body. Yet through it all, he has refused to be consumed by bitterness. Instead, he has dedicated his life to seeking justice, not just for himself, but for his mother, Catherine Carroll. Greg has been relentless in his fight to ensure that the full truth of Brian Doyle's monstrous crime is acknowledged, and that Doyle remains behind bars, where he cannot harm another innocent soul. The wrongful conviction of Parsons sparked a reckoning in Newfoundland's justice system. A government inquiry into his case and 2 other wrongful convictions exposed widespread failures, including police tunnel vision and prosecutorial misconduct. While the province eventually awarded Greg over $1.3 million in compensation, the payments came with no formal admission of wrongdoing. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary faced harsh criticism for its handling of the case, and reforms were introduced, including better police training and changes to investigative procedures. Yet for Greg, no amount of money or policy reform could undo the suffering he endured. Meanwhile, Brian Doyle, the man whose crime set this tragedy in motion, has continued to be a source of anguish. Convicted of second-degree murder in 2002, Doyle was eventually granted parole, despite Greg's impassioned efforts to keep him incarcerated. The parole process itself has been another cruel ordeal, with Greg forced to repeatedly relive his trauma as he delivers victim impact statements. Fighting to ensure his mother's killer faces the consequences he so richly deserves. In 2021, Doyle's parole was revoked after he violated its terms, but in subsequent years he was granted further releases, with Greg tirelessly opposing every step of his reintegration into society. Despite the darkness that has shadowed his life, Greg has built something remarkable from the wreckage. A devoted husband and father, he has found solace in the love of his wife Tina, who stood by him through his worst days. As a firefighter and a lieutenant with the St. John's Regional Fire Department, he has become a respected protector of his community, even earning the title of Firefighter of the Year in 2021. Through it all, he has never stopped being a voice for the wrongfully accused, nor has he abandoned his quest for true justice for his mother. He continues to challenge the system that failed him so completely, raising questions about why Doyle was not charged with first-degree murder and calling for an external review of the prosecution's decisions. Greg Parsons' story is one of unimaginable injustice, but also of resilience, strength, and a relentless pursuit of truth. He is not defined by the years stolen from him, but by his determination to reclaim his life, honor his mother's memory, and ensure that the failures that nearly destroyed him are never repeated. His is a legacy of survival, justice, and an unbreakable spirit that refuses to be silenced. That's it for this episode. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with others. Justice isn't just about the guilty, it's about protecting the innocent. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking the truth, and remember, a wrongful conviction can happen to anyone. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next episode.